By 2013, investigators with the Massachusetts State Police Department had been working for 2 years on an unsolved murder that occurred in Hampton County. Its victim was a 20-year-old girl. From the early days of the investigation, it seemed like it would be easy. However, the police had to go for years in a circle, over and over again to analyze the same evidence, until finally they were able to discover the smallest detail, without which the puzzle of the identity of the criminal could not be put together. In 2011, the Hampton County, Massachusetts Police Department received a disturbing call. They were approached by a 26-year-old guy named Seth Green. He was extremely agitated, literally sobbing into the phone. Seth explained to dispatchers that he found his girlfriend on the floor in her own home. In Chacopa, she was lying in the kitchen and showing no signs of life. No matter how hard he tried, the boyfriend was unable to resuscitate her. Dispatched emergency services to the scene. Law enforcement officers and an ambulance immediately arrived on the scene. Here they found Seth lying in a fetal position on the back porch of the house crying. He was out of breath and unresponsive to the police officer's words, only clutching his cell phone in his hands. After walking through the hallway of the house, police officers found Amanda. Unfortunately, it was already impossible to help her. The medics stated her death, but what struck them most of all was the cruelty with which the girl had been massacred. All the kitchen walls and furniture were covered with blood spatters. It looked as if the assailant had brutalized her, probably used some kind of tool to mutilate the body like that. Forensic experts examined the deceased at the scene and found a huge number of fatal injuries. There were so many of them that the experts couldn't even determine which one killed the victim faster. Her injuries were categorized as stab wounds. Amanda was in her underwear at the time of the attack, but there were no signs of sexual assault. She was probably just walking around the house like that. Apparently, she was attacked when the girl started to get dressed, as she was wearing socks and partially pulled up pants. A broken window in the living room was found at the scene, through which the attacker apparently entered the house. There was also a series of bloody shoe prints, which indicated that the perpetrator had left the same way. The boyfriend's words that he had already found her murdered were partially confirmed. At the time the police arrived, she had already been dead for several hours. This was established by forensic experts during the examination of the scene and the condition of the body. In particular, by the time they arrived, most of the bloodstains had already dried up. One of the law enforcement officers who arrived at the scene reported the incident to the girl's parents. This news shocked the entire family. Amanda could not have enemies. At least obvious, she was the soul of the company and disposes to herself almost anyone. It was hard to imagine that Amanda could have deserved such a thing. Now it was up to Seth to figure out if Amanda's boyfriend was really telling the truth and had nothing to do with what had happened. When Seth came to his senses, he was taken to the nearest police station for questioning. According to the distraught boyfriend, he was living in a house with his lover, Amanda Plass. He was at work during the day and does not know what was going on in the house. And in the evening, when he returned from work, he found his girlfriend, badly injured, on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. The first prime suspect, of course, was Seth, as such cases usually involve partners. There were bloodstains on his clothes, and he had found her body. Seth did a good job of portraying desperation when he called the emergency services and also looked truly distressed when the police arrived at the call. However, some of the police officers questioned whether his reaction was genuine. With good acting skills, he could have simply played out this tragicomedy to confuse the investigation. Police found out that the victim and her boyfriend had recently started dating. Neither her friends nor her family knew much about Seth, and he could well have been a dark figure, but the boyfriend denied his involvement, citing that he had been at work all day. According to him, he was so busy that he couldn't even drop his girlfriend off for a shift in the afternoon. She worked at a restaurant and didn't show up for work that day. Seji was working at a construction site, and he was later found to have had a really busy shift that day. The police interviewed Seth in detail about what tools he was working with that day in hopes of identifying a possible murder weapon. Seth had a job as a carpenter, so naturally he had a number of knives and other tools for working with material. Many tools were kept at Amanda's house as well. According to the guy, one of the knives went missing. When investigators found out about it, they latched on to that fact. Detectives began to press the suspect, asking directly about involvement in the murder. However, the guy denied any possibility of this, insisting that he spent the whole day at the construction site and the knife could have been stolen by someone. Seth claimed that he loved Amanda and had no intention of hurting her. There wasn't enough evidence against the guy to make an arrest. He had no prior criminal record, so he was just released, but he was not cleared of suspicion. The missing knife could have been a murder weapon and was immediately sought at the scene. Unfortunately, the likely murder weapon was never found. By this point, forensic experts had analyzed the bloody shoe prints left by the perpetrator in the house. It became an important piece of evidence because a footprint such as fingerprints are individualized and unique. It was determined that the probable killer came to the crime scene wearing Nike Air Max sneakers. But it seemed odd that the shoes were a small size, 39.5. They could have been both men's and women's. The victim's boyfriend wore a different shoe, a larger size. He didn't have those sneakers at all, and Seth's palm print didn't match the killer's hand. In addition, it was proven that the blood on his clothes appeared after he discovered his girlfriend and tried to render aid to her while in shock. He also had a reliable alibi, and the guy successfully passed a polygraph test. All this allowed to remove all suspicions from him. Despite the fact that the initial assumption of the detectives was not confirmed, there was strong evidence at the crime scene right in front of their noses, which should have helped to quickly find the criminal, but unfortunately it was not done. By this time, the autopsy report on the dead woman's body was ready. The medical examiner confirmed and described in detail in the report how seriously Amanda was dying. The autopsy took over 4 hours. Dozens of stab wounds were found. Her throat alone had been slashed in 3 places. Also, the perpetrator's blade had pierced her heart. At least 2 wounds could have resulted in the victim's death. Given the condition of the blood at the crime scene, forensic experts determined a fairly precise time window in which the murder occurred. The most likely time window was considered to be between 4 and 5 p.m. on the day the body was found. Amanda also had a very large number of defensive wounds. She had clearly put up a desperate fight, but the odds were stacked against her. A large amount of DNA traces of the likely perpetrator were found on the floor of the house. All of the collected material was run through police databases, but not a single match could be obtained, leaving investigators stumped. Detectives began to study the identity of the deceased in more detail to establish the range of possible suspects. Amanda Lynn Plass was born December 11, 1990. Amanda. She grew up in Chicopee, Massachusetts with her brother and sister. She was carefree, free-spirited, and friendly. This was emphasized by her wide smile and curly, unruly hair. The 20-year-old loved poetry, listening to music, making jewelry, and anything related to art. Amanda was good at drawing and taught herself to play the guitar. The girl showed love for tattoos and had several tattoos on her body. She worked in cafes and restaurants as a waitress and hostess. At the time of the incident, she was working at the Franley's restaurant. As it turned out, the 20-year-old kept a diary, but after reading it, investigators found no leads. Amanda seemed like a kind and sweet girl, and she had no enemies. When detectives began interviewing potential witnesses in the area where the murder occurred, they had to go around to many neighbors and friends of the deceased. This is when the officers learned about Jesse, who was Amanda's previous boyfriend. He was a co-worker of hers, and the young men had a brief affair. According to the girl's friends, their breakup was going quite hard. One day, when Seth came to work to pick up his girlfriend, Jesse saw them hugging and literally went into a rage. Multiple witnesses confirmed that he threatened his ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend. This happened just days before the massacre. Therefore, Amanda's acquaintances believed that he may well have hurt her out of jealousy. It was a good lead. After that, the investigators decided to meet with her former young man to ask him some questions. They found a guy easily. He confirmed most of what the witnesses said, saying that he was indeed very jealous and didn't want to let Amanda go. But also the guy said that it was all greatly embellished by random eyewitnesses to the fight. He genuinely loved Amanda, but they couldn't have a relationship due to obvious disagreements and contradictions. Despite this, he had no intention of hurting anyone. In addition, The guy had a reliable alibi. At the time of the murder, Jesse was in the liquor store, and he kept the receipt, which was confirmed. Also, his presence in the store was recorded by video surveillance cameras. Despite this, law enforcement officers took his DNA for analysis and fingerprints, but they did not match the traces found in the victim's home. Already after the second interrogation, Jesse was released, removing all suspicions from him. After that, witnesses were found who claimed that around 4:30 p.m. on the day of the murder, a car was parked in front of Amanda's house, with a female driver behind the wheel. It was established that she came in some four-door white sedan, but no one remembered the license plate number or even the make of the car. The reason why the woman attracted the attention of the victim's neighbors so much was because out of the blue, she sped off and drove off in a very aggressive manner. Some neighbors claimed to have seen this stranger enter Amanda's home. If the perpetrator was a woman, that could well explain the small size of the shoe prints that were found in the kitchen of the murdered girl. Law enforcement officials sounded the alarm in the media. Just the next day, they were approached by a girl named Mercedes. She said she was the one investigators were looking for. It was her white sedan that had been seen near her murdered friend's house. She and Amanda had been friends for a long time and got along well. On that ill-fated day, the girl arrived at her house around 4:18 p.m. because her boyfriend couldn't give her a ride to work. And Amanda was already late and asked her friend to give her a ride. And Mercedes agreed. She pulled up and waited outside for Amanda. Mercedes emphasized that she did not enter her house and waited for her in the driveway. She called her friend several times, but she did not answer. After a brief wait, Mercedes dusted herself off and drove away. She had no idea that at this time her friend might already be lying dead in her own home and now regretted not going to the door. Some of the detectives who led the interrogation did not believe Mercedes. They asked why she never tried to go to the door and knock, which would have been a perfectly logical solution to the problem. According to Mercedes, she was running late at Walmart, so she didn't bother to get out of the auto. But this information was also not credible because the nearest Walmart store was open 24 hours a day and there was no need to rush to it. Despite the disbelief, the new suspect's foot size was smaller than what was found in the house, and the girl successfully passed the polygraph test. She was also later found on surveillance footage at the convenience store, so Mercedes was also ruled out as a suspect. Detectives again found themselves empty-handed, with no new leads forthcoming. They spent many weeks and months searching for the alleged killer, but all to no avail. One very unpleasant situation occurred during the investigation. Several police officers were found to have taken pictures of Amanda's body on their cell phones and then showed them to other police officers and bystanders, which was highly unacceptable. When this came to light, a scandal erupted. The incident significantly strained relations between the Metropolitan Police and the public, who were already unhappy that the investigation had stalled and the perpetrator had not yet been found. A dangerous criminal was walking around at large, and people were expecting more victims, believing him to be a serial killer. After a lengthy investigation, the officers who violated ethical norms were severely reprimanded, and they were also forced to work several shifts without pay. But what bothered the native Amanda the most was not this, but the fact that the police were busy with internal investigations and finding the culprits, showing pictures of the murdered woman. Anything but finding the criminal who committed the murder and was walking the streets of the city. Despite the incapacity of the authorities, Amanda's relatives never gave up hope that they would be able to expose a dangerous criminal. They continued to hand out flyers, post advertisements and billboards, spread information on the internet, and hold memorial events to bring awareness to the horrific incident. 16 months after the investigation began, police officers decided to go back to the very beginning and re-examine everything that might have been missed. It was this that allowed them to find a small detail that completely turned the tide of the investigation. Before that, however, it took months of painstaking but futile scrutiny of a huge amount of data. In October 2013, about 2 years had passed since the murder of Amanda Plass, and it had been 2 months since the state police decided to go through the case files again. They cross-checked interrogation materials, suspect alibis, dozens of photos and videos from the crime scene. It took months, but it was on one particular day that detectives managed to notice one important detail in one photograph. It was an ominous inscription on a marker board that Dennis was here on August 11th, 2011. That is 15 days before Amanda was found dead in her apartment. Up until that point, the name had not yet come up in the investigation, and no one knew who it was. Detectives began working on a new lead. According to Seth, it wasn't the first time a stranger had broken into the girl's home. He was one Dennis, a short Puerto Rican man who lived near the deceased. After he first broke into her house, Amanda recognized the intruder, as neighbors told about him. Later, the girl herself saw the intruder on the street. In August 2011, just a few days after the first break-in, Seth moved into the girlfriend's apartment because she could not feel safe. One day, the Puerto Rican broke into her home again, but was confronted by Amanda's boyfriend, who attempted to apprehend and fight back, but the perpetrator managed to escape. After that, Amanda called him personally, as she knew who he was talking about. The girl wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss his home invasion. About 15 to 20 minutes after the call, Dennis arrived at the house. This occurred in the morning hours. Sage waited on the back porch for the perpetrator to appear so that he could properly memorize his features. Through this encounter, the victim's boyfriend was able to give police officers important new information and was able to describe the perpetrator. The person who came to talk to him looked like a Hispanic male between the ages of 21 to 23, short in stature, with short hair and shaved face. The guy was thin and spoke English fairly well. He came to the meeting with his wife and child, who was about 3 to 4 years old. His companion was much larger. Of course, the Puerto Rican man at the meeting said he had no involvement in the incident and didn't understand what it was about. He deliberately brought his wife and child to the meeting to give the impression of a decent family man and to avert suspicion. The neighbor across the street watched for a while and told Amanda what he had seen. He confirmed that the Hispanic man who had come to the meeting was the intruder who had broken into her home. He initially looked out for the Puerto Rican man himself, but later recognized him as the man he had seen the night before. Amanda didn't want trouble, but she had one of her prized possessions missing. The girl just wanted the thief to return it. Amanda didn't threaten him with the police or any other means. That being said, she didn't take a long time to sort out who was right and who was at fault, simply accusing the stranger of stealing. He was outraged by this turn of events and denied the theft. Conflict was avoided. He promised to return the missing item, and they parted ways. And later, Amanda was murdered, and it didn't seem like a coincidence to the police. It seemed that the investigation would finally get off the ground. The cops have a man who started a conflict with the victim. He had also repeatedly shown malice against her and even broken the law, but he got away with it all because of Amanda's natural kindness. He had a motive, and Dennis was a suitable suspect. However, it took the police quite some time to get the case started because they had nothing but the name Dennis and now needed to identify him and find a suspect. By 2013, detectives had identified 2 likely suspects. One of them lived in the neighborhood where the massacre victim was found. His rap sheet included criminal episodes. He was on several police databases when he came to the attention of law enforcement. His specialty was violence. He clearly had the ability to harm another person. However, the problem was that this man was white. He didn't look Hispanic. He was also significantly larger than the killer, with a larger shoe size. He was tested but was ruled out as a suspect. The second was a man named Dennis Rosa Roman, who lived a couple blocks from the victim's home. His name, build, height were just right. He also had a larger girlfriend and a son who was 4 years old at the time of the investigation. Most importantly, he was Hispanic. It all fit. The cops felt this was the man they were looking for. Investigators cross-checked the victim's cell phone and found 9 calls that were made between the alleged killer and his victim. 5 of them were incoming calls. The length of communication ranged from a few seconds to a minute and a half. All of them were made on July 28, 2011, which means that he was the one being argued with. There was one small but important detail. When Seth was provided with a series of photos with men, one of which was Dennis, the guy didn't recognize him, probably because he didn't remember him well. But despite this, the investigators showed great interest in his person and wanted to question this new figure in the investigation as soon as possible. On October 26, 2013, police officers were able to track down Dennis while he was in the Westfield area. Detectives offered to talk to him at the station, but exercising his legal right, he refused, on the pretext that he was very busy. The officers then asked him if he knew a girl named Amanda who lived in the Chicopee neighborhood. The guy became visibly nervous and replied that he knew many girls named Amanda from the neighborhood and did not know who they were talking about. Officers described to him the girl's tattoos and other distinguishing features, after which the suspect admitted that he knew her as a neighbor. He lived a couple blocks away, but denied having been in close contact with the deceased. Detectives then began to press the young man. Then he said he was busy and had to go and stop communicating. According to him, he had important things to do, but a few days later he promised to come to the police himself to communicate with law enforcement officers, and he did not deceive. On November 1st, 2013, Dennis called the police station. He wanted to tell the investigators something that had been bothering him for days after their meeting. The boyfriend arrived at the Westfield station on his own and was interviewed afterward. He provided his DNA sample for analysis and comparison. In addition, even at this meeting, the guy was wearing Nike Air Max sneakers. However, a check of the shoe tread showed that it was a different pair, not identical to the one used in the massacre of the young girl 2 years ago. Still, detectives concluded that he liked that model of Ubovi and his size matched. While talking to investigators, the suspect made the unexpected statement that had been bothering him so much. He revealed that he knew the person involved in Amanda's death. However, the guy was afraid to give his name and tell anything as he feared that the same fate awaited him as the unfortunate Amanda. However, after the first communication, this story changed. Then again and again, this comb of lies grew with each new word. And everything the suspect said did not match the material uncovered by the investigation. By this point, DNA testing was underway. The lab technicians matched it to the organics found under the victim's fingernails. To eliminate any errors, they made more than 20 different tests, which showed the maximum similarity between the skin particles under the fingernails of the dead girl and the samples provided by Dennis. This was already strong evidence of his involvement in the murder. The detectives then began to talk to him more directly, pointing out that the DNA samples matched. Then, out of desperation, the suspect began to shift the blame to his younger brother, who was hit by a bus and died a short time after the murder of Amanda Plass. The guy believed that they had the same DNA, and he was the one who committed the crime. So, of course, he was trying to avoid responsibility by shifting the blame to a dead man who would get nothing. But the detectives refuted his arguments. On November 5th, Dennis was placed under arrest. His house was searched, but the same pair of Nike sneakers was not found. Probably, for 2 years of investigation, he has already managed to get rid of these sneakers, the murder weapon, or bloody clothes. Neither could be found, apparently for the same reasons. However, DNA results conclusively showed that he was the one involved in the bloody events at the innocent victim's home. The Hispanic man was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecutor's office requested the maximum possible sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole for him. Amanda's trial began on July 7, 2016. The defendant never pleaded guilty to the brutal crime. However, the prosecution had every reason to convict him. The Latino man had an extensive history of domestic violence, which he had wielded against his cohabitant and child. He could have been called a record holder for the number of police calls related to his behavior at home. However, he went further, and on the day of Amanda's death, he was involved in an armed burglary in which he tried to steal money and a cell phone from her to buy substances. It was the robbery that was thought to be the motive for the crime. However, the situation got out of hand when he caught the girl in the house. He was uncovered. A conflict ensued, and he used one of the knives in the house to brutalize Amanda. In addition to domestic violence and other criminal episodes, Dennis was actively engaged in the distribution of illegal substances, for which he was also repeatedly prosecuted. The defendant himself, despite physical evidence in the form of DNA under the fingernails of the deceased, did not plead guilty. But now he has told a new story. According to the defendant, he was indeed at the scene of the crime, but he did not kill the girl. He was only going to rob her, so there was a struggle between them. That's how his DNA ended up under the victim's fingernails. But Dennis was not prepared for the fact that the theft would turn into a bloodbath by another intruder. At the same time, he persistently refused to give the name of the killer, allegedly under threat of death. At the same time, the prosecution had more than just DNA samples and evidence. The size of the defendant's sneakers exactly matched the marks left by the blood on the floor of the house. The palm print on the sill of the broken window matched Dennis's hand, as did all the DNA traces analyzed. Nevertheless, defense attorneys supported the defendant's story. According to them, he was indeed at the scene of the crime and saw the massacre carried out by the killer. On the spot, the guy could not do anything to prevent Amanda's death, and now had to cover for the real killer, as he feared for his life and the health of his loved ones. However, there was no evidence to suggest that there was another person in the house. No shoe prints, no fingerprints, no DNA. According to the defendant, this trial at this point posed a direct threat to his family, as it could provoke the real killer to aggression. In addition, the defense attorneys blamed law enforcement officials for not conducting an extensive enough investigation and ignoring many other suspect options. Separately, the defense drew attention to the episode involving the distribution of crime scene photos, which severely delayed the investigation. During this time, evidence could have been lost, and this delay prevented the investigation from being objective. The police officers were under severe pressure because of this incident. They needed to solve the crime as soon as possible to appease the outraged locals, so the police grabbed the first person they could find and charged him with murder. Many people complained about the police officers because they were too distracted by internal problems. According to a lot of people, because of this, they were completely oblivious to the real problem that needed to be solved as quickly as possible. Dennis himself actually handed them the keys to the case when he agreed to speak to the law and also provided his DNA sample for examination. In any case, the jury had to discuss the enormous amount of information that had been accumulated on the case. Testimony in court took over 8 days. Deliberations lasted about 5 hours, after which the jury unanimously found Dennis guilty of the first-degree murder of Amanda Plass. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defendant and his attorneys were extremely negative about the decision. They believed the sentence was unfair. However, the prosecutor denied this. The prosecutor considered the sentence deserved because the guilt of Dennis was proved completely by a lot of irrefutable evidence. Amanda was very fond of sunflowers, so this plant became the symbol of the company, which was aimed at amending the law that prohibits first responders from filming on a personal phone and distributing images of victims. The bill was passed in August 2022,